The aim of this video is to explore the perspectives of how children and families might perhaps view inclusion within their community. It aims to focus on how policies are set in place in the classroom and in society to promote the ideology of an inclusive pedagogy, but in a practical environment they can tell a different tale. It will seek to discuss how inclusive pedagogy in our teaching can already be limited by the exclusion that exists on our doorstep. Edinburgh, whilst architecturally beautiful, boasts well-known shops and things to do all over the city that are inaccessible to families with wheelchairs and/or special needs buggies. One of the more famous streets, Printer Street, is home to a Marks & Spencer. In 2018, M&S introduced an easy dressing range, from daywear to nightwear to schoolwear, adapted for children who need extra help. Whether the clothes have discreet pockets for feeding tubes, are super gentle on sensitive skin, or simply easier to dress and wear, the aim of the range is said to help make dressing quicker, more comfortable, easier, practical and much more fun. This video will tell the story of how their accessible clothing range sadly appears to be anything but accessible. It is important to look at how inclusive pedagogy is not just an educational concept, but one that stretches beyond the classroom. It is not just a teaching concept, but a human concept. It is perhaps our ideas around inclusion holistically and not just classroom-based pedagogy that drives our view of education for children. Inclusive pedagogy regards a shift in thinking to respond to every child's needs so that all children have an opportunity to participate. It does not simply regard adaptation for all to complete an activity. It regards understanding, viewing, implementing and promoting inclusive education to make a difference so greatly in the classroom that it becomes embedded in the thoughts of individuals and communities, to therefore grow in our society. If we use the example of Hart's internal and external forces, it could be argued that it is the opportunities we create and sustain for children that shape their states of mind, which can expand or constrain their learning capacity. The external force discussed here is an easy dressing uniform. If a child cannot easily access or easily wear a uniform that every other child in the school wears, internal forces such as social acceptance, belonging and school values may affect a child and therefore their capacity to learn. Additionally, we had difficulties in communicating with the bus driver about them lowering the front of the bus. If a child who needs a wheelchair or special needs buggy has had difficult encounters on public transport, this may lead them to have negative and uncomfortable internal thoughts about school before they have even arrived on the premises. These thoughts could specifically impact their learning capacity at the beginning and end of the school day. If our view of pedagogy does not consider the limits that exist within the wider world, we cannot begin to consider how such limits can affect children's internal forces and how to act to overcome them. We are now arriving at M&S with hopes to look at, try on and hopefully purchase some of their easy dressing range. To understand both inclusion and exclusion within the community, we must first look at what communities are made up of and how participation happens. Communities are not just physical spaces, they are a set of relationships where identities, connections and spirit is created. As Apade and Reach explore how 21st century communities have separate groups within them and each holds different agendas. It is these agendas that can form connections and therefore strengthen the groups, but can also result in these groups excluding certain values. This raises questions regarding how we can create inclusive communities in a world full of individual thought. Black Hawkins' framework for participation strengthens this idea, stating that educational inclusion is influenced by social, economic and political concepts at a local, national and global level. It's within these communities that disagreements exist regarding the concepts and their relation to social justice and reforms. This is mirrored in the complex differences highlighted between how inclusion is defined in policy and how it is acted upon in practice. It is not enough to know and believe in inclusive pedagogy, but how we do it. This further suggests that inclusion is not simply an educational concept. It is not reflected in our roles but in our values. It is this value of inclusion in a wider community that helps shape the pedagogy within the school community. When trying to reach the children's range on the basement floor, the second lift we needed to take was out of order. Luckily, a kind M&S worker offered to take us on the staff lift. Whilst the individual worker responded to our needs and gave us a helpful solution, as you can see here, it was tricky to manage and added stress and uncomfortable feelings to the situation. Internally, this may create emotional barriers surrounding the uncertainty of accessibility when wanting to visit Edinburgh or other places in the future. This is an example of equity, everyone receiving the support that they need in that moment. The cause of the inequity, the broken lift, and the independence that has broken with it has not been addressed. This example follows the medical model by portraying the problem to be within the individual for needing an additional route and not at a social level. Whilst we can see the inclusive values shown by the M&S worker, we cannot see them strongly enough within the M&S community as a whole, which feeds into the inclusive values of Edinburgh's community. If we look at how, when and why the range was developed, it helps us to understand the power of listening and how from an early childhood, listening and the response that follows holds the possibility to create a sense of belonging and inclusion in communities. The process of the range took 2 years and involved listening to survey responses of 300 parents and working closely with parents from 3 specialist schools and a paediatrician. The products are said to be inclusively designed and modelled closely on their main collection. It is pedagogical listening that enables us to see barriers in any environment, such as accessing a school uniform, that we have the power to help a child to overcome. After a quite stressful journey, we finally arrived at M&S's children's range, only to be told that the easy dressing range was not in stock because there was not a great need for it at the Princes Street store. I found this hard to believe considering it is situated on one of the main streets in Scotland's capital. We were told we could only order online. It did not matter that the clothes would need trying on before purchasing. It did not matter that you could not feel the fabrics, check the sizing, or even pick your favourites from the range. It did not matter that the clothing range, designed to follow its one direct aim to be accessible and promote inclusion within the school and wider community, was actually the opposite, inaccessible. We then decided to try a few cafes off Princes Street for lunch, but as you will see, we were further faced with additional accessibility issues. GERFIC has been criticised for having a universal, inclusive framework that, whilst well-intended, does not specifically prioritise needs of particular groups. This lack of recognition may be viewed as problematic and result in unintentional exclusion. From this perspective, it may result in lack of funding for accessibility and, as we have seen, exclude people from society. The notion of transformability and principles of everybody states teachers are in a privileged position to act for change for the better. As educators, it is important to understand the learning opportunities that are present with participation in the classroom community. Through this, we can begin to understand the learning that is present from participating in a wider community and the implications of denying it. Here we see 2 kind people offer to help us after we had difficulties with the steps. This further shows inclusive values run much deeper than classroom-based pedagogy. We returned home after a disappointing trip and decided to look at the range online and were met with some unfortunate reviews. This video is not to criticise or attack M&S for the range, any individual persons, nor for how M&S adapted a stressful situation to overcome accessibility issues. The range is still in its early stages of development and its criticisms will help to continue to create better ranges, not just in M&S but with the hope that other stores will follow its lead. Its existence reflects the growth of inclusive communities. However, its existence also reflects the difficulties in how something as simple as purchasing a school uniform cannot be inclusive. M&S has been used as an example because it is a major British retailer. The points this video has raised could be witnessed in any city, shop or community, and this is where our barriers lie. If there are barriers to inclusive pedagogy before a child enters school, this is going to impact their education. Pedagogical practice begins with our inclusive values and how we craftily use them and our pedagogical tact to respond to the complexities faced in policy and practice. We must first consider inclusive issues within the community to successfully gain a more universal image of inclusive issues in the classroom. Inclusive pedagogy must be defined, threaded and identical both in the school community and in the wider community before we can fully understand and feel its impact on a level that will empower change.